Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my presentation on IEPs as it relates to children impacted by FASD. A few of you have seen this presentation before and have asked if there's been copies that you could take home, and while I didn't have it at that time, I have decided to go ahead and just record the video, and so that you've got something that you can refer to in the future. So first of all, within our Ontario school system, we have what we know as the big I's, the IEPs, the IPRCs, and other info. For today's purposes, we're only going to look at the IPRCs and the IEPs. And we're going to kind of skip over the other info because I think most of you probably know that when you're dealing with someone impacted by FASD, you want to have a neuropsychological assessment or a psych ed assessment. You want to have an occupational therapist involved. You want a speech language pathologist involved. And then a medical practitioner is really the only one that can actually do the diagnosis. In terms of an IPRC, the main thing that I want you to be aware of here is for FASD, we always want to ask for the physical identification. We do not want to have it listed as behavioral. And the reason for that is because the connotation behind a behavioral identification is that they have choice, that they can choose to do the behavior or make the choices that they are, and that they just need different circumstances and so on in order to make that good choice. Whereas with an individual impacted by FASD, they do not. They simply do not have the brain capacity to do so. And so that's why it would be considered physical. The best example I can give you would be if a child was to suffer a concussion, we would expect certain behaviors to be associated with that. They're going to complain about headaches. They're going to have attention difficulties. They're going to have visual tracking difficulties. They're going to talk about how their brain is foggy and that they need things chunked, made into simpler forms. We would not, under any circumstances, consider someone impacted by a concussion to say that that's a behavioral identification. We would understand a concussion to be physical. It's easy to see that it came from a physical act. Well, FASD is the same thing. FASD comes about, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, comes about as a physical act. That physical act was the consumption of alcohol as the brain was being formed. And so even though we may not necessarily have seen it at the time, there was a physical act involved, and so there's a physical ramification to it, and that's why we want to identify FASD as a physical identification. Moving on then, we're going to take a look at our IEPs and what an IEP should look like for a child impacted by FASD. Some good friends of mine who I helped out with in terms of the development of their child's IEP in conjunction with their school was kind enough to allow me to use their example. And while I would not consider this IEP to be an A, I would certainly consider it to be a B+. So as we go through it, please keep that in mind. Also recognize IEP stands for, as you can see at the top there, Individual Education Plan. This is only a template. It may not necessarily reflect where your child is at and the needs and accommodations that your child would have to have. Certainly a large part of that is based on their cognitive ability. In this particular case, this IEP is working pretty good for this student, and really that's all you're looking for, is find some that's working for your child. So as you can see in this particular case, we're looking at an IEP that comes from the Algonquin Lakeshore Catholic District School Board. Each school board does have their own, are able to determine the format of their IEPs in terms of the look. And so the look may look a little bit different, but the sections are required by the Ministry of Education. So the sections that we go through here, you should see those same sections within your IEP. One that tends to get forgotten at times is the transition plan. And so that would, when we get to that portion, you'll want to make sure that your child's IEP has a transition plan as well. So as we can see here, this is what I would call the tombstone data. Tombstone data is where you're going to see the child's name, birth date, their student number. All of this generally comes from the registration when you first register the child in the school. You can see we're looking at the 2017-2018 school year. This IEP was initially completed on October 4th, 2017. Keep in mind, though, it is considered to be a living document, and a living document means it can be revised at any time in any situation. It does not require a formal meeting. It does not require an IPRC for the revisions to be done to the IEP. The IPRC, really all it's accomplishing is it's going to determine the identification. It's also going to determine the placement. So in this particular case, you'll notice that the placement is the regular classroom. Let's see if I can get my cursor to work here. Regular class with resource assistance. So this particular child is going to be in the regular classroom. The resource teacher is going to be helping out and monitoring and working with the classroom teacher. This placement started on the first day of school. And the reason for the IEP was because they did have an IPRC and he was identified with multiple identifications. And in this particular case, that multiple identification would reflect both the physical identification for the FASD, which we'll look at the diagnosis here shortly, as well as a cognitive aspect. In this particular case, I believe it's going to be a learning disability. You'll then see the 3 reporting dates that are listed there. Your IEP will come with all 3 of these reporting dates. The first one is the progress report. Second one is the first report card at the end of first semester, and the last one is at the end of the school year. One thing to note here, the IEPs are required to be passed out within the first 30 days of the school year, and so that's why the IEP completion date is up here as well, in terms of October 4th. In some cases, because of how close the dates are between that 30 days and when the progress reports go out, sometimes you'll see situations where the first reporting date is only the IEP completion date. Sources for IEP creations. Again, the main thing that you should be looking for here is what sources did they refer to in creating this IEP. Obviously, we want to see the medical information, clinical assessments, educational assessments. These are the professional assessments where most of our information should be coming from. IEP should not be developed on the opinion of educators or opinions of other than professionals, and so you want to make sure that assessments are being seen there. Apparently my dog is a little itchy, if you can hear the background noise. Okay, in terms of IEP Development Team. IEP Development Team, you will see the educators that were also involved. You should see your special education resource teacher. You should see the classroom teachers. You should see the principal. You may have student services involved, depending on whether it's an elementary or high school panel that we're looking at. But in this particular case, especially if you're in one of the smaller elementary schools, the one big thing that I would really look for here is we do not want to see the special education resource teacher being the same person as a classroom teacher. When you have someone who is fulfilling both roles, that's not a good situation. You always want to have a second pair of eyes looking at the IEP. And if the educator is also the resource teacher, the checks and balances can become problematic. And so that's the main one that you want to see there. Okay, moving on. Next section. This is where we're going to see our assessments. And within our assessments, you'll see the date of the assessment, what type of an assessment it was, who did the assessment, and then finally a summary of whatever the diagnosis or results were. This has to come directly from the assessment. Now, in this particular case, you'll notice here that a diagnosis was given of partial fetal alcohol syndrome, or PFAS. We no longer use that diagnosis. Everyone is simply diagnosed as FASD, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But because this is the exact wording out of that assessment, that has to remain there. However, when we come further down to the diagnosis, scrolling down, you will see that we have the official diagnosis of this case. And this one is where we're going to put the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And you'll notice that the second diagnosis is there's also an intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is why in the identification it was named as multiple, because intellectual disability is a separate identification from a physical disability. In this particular case, our strengths and needs. And this is a key one. And again, our strengths and needs really should be coming from a professional assessment. Our strengths and needs should not be based on, as parents or even as educators, what we see within those particular situations as the child's strengths and needs. It needs to be based on something that has documentation, something that has assessment. And so these needs, you'll notice here that in a lot of cases our needs tend to be more needs than there tend to be strengths if we have an IEP, but we want to try to keep it balanced as much as possible. This can change from IEP to IEP. What we have done here is we have listed our top 5 needs. In my own son's particular case, I only list 2 needs because those 2 needs are the 2 that I want to have focused on for this particular IEP in this particular year. The following year, if we see that those needs are not so great, that there's other needs that are now higher priority, we're going to change the section to reflect those needs. And our IEP then is going to develop the plan to be able to shore those up. The strengths, though, are the key aspect here, because strengths is where we always find our solutions. And I cannot stress that enough. We never find our solutions by working on our needs. We can spend hours and days and years trying to bring our needs up, trying to make them stronger than they are. However, there's physical reasons for why those needs are there. They're not something we're necessarily going to be able to change. All we're looking at doing is ensuring that those needs are not at a level that they're hampering our strengths. And the example that I can give you is, if you have a child who, let's say, is suffering from anxiety, and they're constantly afraid of what might be happening next, they're not going to be capable of learning, because all they can focus on is where the next surprise is going to come from, what they need to do to protect themselves at all costs. And so the need in this case would be to find a safe place. Once we have that under control, once they're able to start learning, now we're going to focus on their strengths. And that's where we're going to find our success. And that's where we're going to get our self-esteem brought up. And that's where we're going to start seeing the child can go, oh, I can do this. I just need to do it in this way. And so that's why we always want to make sure these strengths are listed. And we want to list as many of them. And in fact, every strength possible needs to be listed in here, because that's how we're going to teach. That's what we're developing the IEP from, is these strengths. Okay, next section, accommodations. Now, in terms of accommodations, you'll notice that there are 4. Sometimes on some IEPs, you'll only see 3. Instructional, environmental assessments. For Lakeshore Algonquin, they also list health, but it's not necessary. This is the section, as parents, you really have more say than anywhere else. Because what we want to list under these accommodations is basically everything that can potentially help your child to learn. So, if you know that they learn best by being in collaboration with somebody else, okay, we want buddy or peer tutoring here. If we know that they have some attention difficulties, okay, we're going to put in cueing. If we know that their processing speed is a little bit slower and so it takes them longer to figure out things, we're going to put in extra time for processing. Again, we know that routine is the key to any success. That when we eliminate the surprises, that everything is going to be all right and that we're going to be able to accomplish this. And so all of these accommodations, anything that we think would potentially be able to help the child, should be listed through here. These can be added to. It doesn't necessarily mean that the accommodations are going to be used all the time. It simply means that the teacher has the flexibility to implement them as needed. And that is based on their professional judgment. If in a particular situation, let's say that they have assistive technology, but they only need to write a couple words down off of the board in terms of their agenda, well, we're not necessarily going to have them get out their Chromebook, log in, type it all in, share it. We're just going to have them get their agenda out and write the 1 or 2 words. Because in that particular case, it's more efficient to have them do the handwriting. Okay, moving on to the next section. We now are starting to look at what we know as our modified programming or our alternative programming. If a child is able to meet Ontario curriculum standards, we are going to have what we call an accommodated program. And an accommodated program simply means that we're going to give them these accommodations, but they're still going to be expected to do class expectations and Ontario curriculum expectations in all cases. However, if they cannot meet Ontario curriculum expectations, even with these accommodations, we're now going to go to modified pages. If there's something that's holding them back from just being able to learn in general, then we're probably going to look at an alternative page as well. So let's start to move into what type of programming they have. The first one, as you can see, is what we call our language arts. And the language arts in this case is modified. This section right here is one that a lot of people get confused by. This is your baseline. This is what came from last year or the previous IEP. And so this is our starting point so that we know what type of expectations are realistic for this year. And so we go and we look at last year's report card and we look at last year's IEP, and off the report card we will get an overall grade, or it may be toward the end of the year because that's when the highest achievement is going to be seen. Last year we saw that this particular student got a B in reading, but was working at a grade 5 level. In writing, he got a C last year, but was working at a grade 3 level. Last year he got a B, working at class level, grade 6, and in media literacy got a B and was working at grade 5 level. So when we come here to our annual program goal is what can we realistically expect to achieve by the end of this school year? What level do we want him to be achieving by the time grade 7 ends? And so he is then going to, in this particular case, going to be working at grade level. It just won't be to the same number. What's important to recognize here, though, is IEPs are only refer to what's being assessed. It's not referring to what's being taught. In this particular case, this child is likely going to be taught all aspects of the grade 7 curriculum. He's only going to be graded on these particular things. And so the grade on the report card is going to refer to these particular things, which is why the IEP always comes with the report card. So as we go through, you will see right up at the top it says there must be a measurable learning expectation. And it's the measurable and specific part that is the key aspect. If you do not understand exactly what is being graded and how it's being graded, then it is not meeting expectations. And this is the part where you would send it back and say, I don't understand what you're doing here. I need it more specific. I need it more measurable. You should be able to walk out and say, okay, I know exactly what's being graded on this report card now. So in this particular case, he's going to identify and order main ideas and supporting details. So he's going to find the main ideas and supporting details. He's going to put them in order. He's going to group them into units that could be used to develop a multi-paragraph piece in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Is he actually writing here? He is not. He is simply brainstorming and getting his ideas pulled together in a way that he could potentially write a paragraph off of it. And so this is more about organizing his ideas. And he's going to have 5 opportunities to do so, and we want to see him successfully achieve it in 4 of them. How is he going to be taught? He's going to be shown his success criteria, and it's going to be reviewed every single time. There's going to be an anchor chart that he can refer to that is going to show him exactly how it needs to be grouped and what it needs to look like. There's going to be conferencing between him and the teacher, and then there's going to be modeling where it's actually demonstrated to him. And then finally, it's going to be assessed using a rubric. In this particular case, I would say it's likely the success criteria. In terms of reading, he will analyze a variety of texts, both simple and complex. So he's going to have both complex texts as well as simple texts, or books in this case, and explain how the different elements contribute to meaning. And so he's going to likely have a conference with the teacher and tell the teacher how the different elements of the literature affect this. And then finally, what is the audience reaction going to be to that? He's going to have 10 opportunities to do this. We want to see him be successful in 7 of them. Success in this particular case would be considered 70% or a C. And as we move along, you'll see in our oral communication, we have much the same thing. Again, I would stress, if you do not understand what is being graded and how it's being graded, this needs to be redone. Okay, math, also modified. Again, we look at our baseline. We'll see here that our number sense is grade 4. You got a C plus in it. The measurement, he was at a grade 4 level and got a B. When we jump down here, though, you'll notice this is a really large jump. Their number sense expectation is going to be a grade 7 modified. So what they're saying is they're suddenly moving him, even though he only got a C plus in grade 4 in number sense, they're suddenly asking him to now do a grade 7 expectation. Under what justification? That's a really good question. And so that's why I would say in this particular case, I would consider this IEP to be more of a B level than an A level, because these are some really large jumps happening here. I would expect to see more like a grade 5 modified level here, possibly a grade 6, but the fact that he got a C plus on it last year makes me really concerned about this particular one. Same way with patterning and algebra. You got a B at a grade 4. Okay, you know what? Maybe we could look at doing a grade 6 level, jumping all the way up to a grade 7. Okay, that's really a challenge. Now, for probability, you got an A at a grade 5 level. Absolutely, I could see a grade 7 for this particular one. Okay, physical education. In this particular case, there's only a comment in that because he will have a choice to participate in alternate activity in the event he's not comfortable with the planned activity. This is an accommodation. And so he will have the opportunity to be assessed in a different way than the rest of the class. Is he still meeting Ontario expectations though? Yes, he is, as long as the activity he's being asked still corresponds to it. Because he's in grade 7, this is not an EKO provincial year. Only grade 3, grade 6, grade 9, and grade 10 would you see this as a yes. And so the same accommodations that we saw earlier are going to be listed here as well. In terms of resources, the resources here, he does get an occupational therapist once a month. He gets an educational assistant as directed by the teacher. The resource teacher is involved daily and is actually pulling him out of the class to support in certain situations. Other times, the resource teacher is helping out within the class as needed. And then he's also receiving counseling through the school on an as-needed basis. The educational assistant one is one that a lot of people raise, and it's one that I really encourage people. You do not want one-on-one support, especially with a child impacted by FASD. And the reason you don't is because if the child is in a safe situation, is capable of learning, is working at a level that's appropriate for them, they're using their strengths, they can achieve a certain level of independence. Now, is there constant monitoring? Is there constant support around them? Is there external brains that are keeping eyes out for them? Absolutely there is, and that's the model that we want to be using. So in this particular case, this is why the educational assistant is readily available. But are they actually creating a dependent relationship with this child? They are not. And that's the stress part here that I want to make sure that people understand. Because in a one-on-one situation with an educational assistant, you're going to create a level of dependency. And all of a sudden, at some point, maybe after they graduate from grade 12, they're not going to have that dependent support anymore. And so you want to be preparing them for that eventuality. And so we want to not get into a dependent relationship, but we want to develop an independent relationship, which is why we don't want an educational assistant one-on-one. In terms of specialized equipment, this child has a computer with adaptations, includes an iPad, includes a laptop, primarily to help with writing and organizational aspects. In terms of consultations, these are when all the meetings happen. You'll notice in this particular case, the principal met with the parents, classroom teacher, the resource teacher was also involved. They talked initially about what the IEP is going to look like. They met again, reviewed it, continued to have consultation on it. Again, looked at it. Oh, we're going in reverse here. So the first one was on September 12th. They met, talked about it, met again on September 25th, continued to review it on October 23rd. Pretty happy with it at this point now. And that's what we're looking in this particular case. Transition plan. And this is the one that I was saying before, make sure it's here. Every IEP requires a transition plan. And so anytime this child is going to go through a change or a transition, we want to have a plan in place. We want to have strategies in place. This is where it's going to be listed. And in this particular case, they're basically making sure that he's able to get into the school all right. He's able to get out of the school all right. He's got supervision during those more unsupervised times, such as recess. Finally, at the end, you'll see a principal's signature. The principal is ultimately responsible for the implementation of the IEP and is the one held responsible. And then finally, the parents, you have an example where you can make. So that concludes my presentation on IEPs. I hope that was helpful to you. Once again, if you have any questions, you can certainly feel free to contact me at my email address, robmore629@gmail.com. And the big thing that I would just really stress here as well, in my experience, having been a special education educator for more than 25 years now, any resource teacher wants to work with you. Any principal wants to work with you. Most of the time when you get opposition, it's because, number one, they either don't understand, and so they're having an initial reaction to that misunderstanding, or things are being asked that they simply don't have the capability of delivering. And so that is going to create some stress. The big thing that I have found within our advocacy, working with our principals, working with my children's principals, as long as we're asking for things that are realistic, As long as we're asking for things that they can do, the school is more than happy to deliver. And because they want to see the success of your child just as much as you do. We never want to see a child fail. We recognize they all have strength. They all are unique in their own way. They're all capable of being contributing members of society. They're all people that we can learn from. I am constantly reminded of just how my children just refuse to give up. They will work and work and work and work. And life is hard for them, but you know what? When they're tapping into the strengths, when they're in good places, when they're being supported, they can be successful. And as long as we continue to have that hope and that belief, that's the starting point. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and stay strong. Make sure you collaborate, and you will find success. Thank you.